Okay, so just real quickly, I have another slide that goes into a little more detail about this. So as I mentioned, you have meat powder, which automatically, what we say, elicits salivation. Okay, it's an automatic response. Okay, we call the meat powder in this case unconditioned stimulus. It wasn't learned. It just happens. Okay, salivation is an unconditioned response. Again, just automatic. Okay, we introduce a neutral stimulus. So what Pavlov did is that once he saw the connection here, he kind of played around with it. He did several things with it. He introduced a bell. Okay, and basically he presents what we call a neutral stimulus, in this case a bell. A bell doesn't elicit salivation. Okay, but he figures if he's going to pair it enough times with the meat powder, he can make it elicit salivation, and that's what he did. So again, he repeated these pairings of the bell and the meat powder, bell and meat powder, and then over time, what he found out is just the bell by itself would elicit salivation. And then he had terms for all of these, which, you know, you can get lost in all the terminology for these, and I just want you to get the concept rather than the terms. But the fact of the matter is that now this is this is something that's a learned behavior. So they've learned now to respond to the bell. Okay, and we call this a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response, simply because it's learned, where the other one was not. And as we mentioned, we notice behavior change as a result of experience and exposure. So what do we know about these? So what? What does this have to do with me or anybody else? And what does this mean? Okay, we know that classical conditioned behaviors, okay, behaviors that are learned through this process, we know that occurs with human beings. We can account for certain behaviors that we have via this process. Okay, when we talk about operant conditioning, there's many more so under operant that we can account for. But there are some that have to do with classically conditioned responses. We know that the learning of emotional responses, there's a lot of connection here with classically conditioned responses, okay? And some early evidence to sort of prove this point, you've probably heard of John Watson, stout behaviorist, wrote a very famous book that influenced the field of psychology, is probably the largest influence. Actually, he wrote several of them having to do with behavior. I can't remember all the names of them offhand, but him and also Skinner as well we'll get to, that have been very influential. But Watson pretty much, he wanted to go a bit further, and he did experiments with I want to say that it was maybe like a 16-month-old. He wasn't quite 2 years old. A little boy named Albert. You guys remember this from classes? Okay. Very famous, very considered unethical study at this point in time. However, in this study, he really provided evidence of learned emotional experiences associated with neutral stimuli. So just like that bell in the other scenario, via this process. Now what he did is he had this child basically seated at a table, and he would present the child with, he did different variations of this, so this is just my memory of it, but he'd present the child with a furry rabbit, okay? But at the same time he's presenting the child with a furry rabbit, he's behind the child, and he kind of pounds on the table. So he does what would elicit a very natural physiological response as we startle, right? Okay? So what he's doing is he's pairing that, okay, that action of startling the child, he's pairing that with the rabbit. So every time the child is exposed to that rabbit, he's getting this startle reaction. Well, what he did is he really explained, Okay, phobias. Okay, we tend to have emotional reactions to very much neutral stimuli, but there's something that's occurred, okay, at least a learning theorist would suggest, there's something that occurred at some point for that individual that they made a connection. Anxiety with the dog. Okay, anxiety, whatever it is, it can manifest in very different, there's kind of typical phobias, but actually it can run the gamut. So in this case, he did this and did this and did this, so obviously the child, when it sees the rabbit without Watson or Rayner being present, the child is anxious, nervous, starts crying. Okay, which is not a normal reaction upon seeing a rabbit, typically. Okay, that's not what would happen. So again, he induced that. That's something that was learned. Okay, it came to be conditioned. It was unfortunate because if I remember correctly, that child was then taken somewhere and nobody ever unconditioned that. So that adult later on probably went on to fear all kinds of rabbits and white furs and all kinds of things. So, it was no way can we do anything even remotely near that, which is good. But definitely at the time, didn't have those restrictions like we do now. So this was a very prominent case that lends support to the fact that classical conditioning does occur with human beings. Can any of you think of any right now? Off the top of your head. And I have to tell you, it doesn't always have to be, it could be positive emotional responses too. People, you've heard of fetishes. Okay, the whole premise behind fetishes, behind why this particular male has this fetish for high heel shoes, we would say, something happened here. That's what we would say. Okay.
I had one that I had a foster family get a child, and he really had a fear of water, extreme fear of water. And it could be a dish of water, it could be a huge pool of water, it didn't matter. I mean, he really feared water. And they worked on him for, they got him like a year, so they had him till he was almost 3. And by then they could get him to stand on the edge in a little pool on the edge, and which was good. And he would tolerate to some extent his bath time. But he really didn't like a sink full of water. It didn't matter. He just had this really huge fear of water, and he was developing normally. It's just this water thing. So I would wonder.
And phobias can become so bad that it really can cripple the person depending upon what it is. That if it's a social phobia where they don't want to be out amongst others, they don't want to be in closed places. You've heard of people not wanting to get on an airplane because again it's a closed space, that kind of thing. But there's so many different ones. But this is what we tend to look at as being kind of the underlying process that was learned. So the whole idea when someone comes to therapy, if it's a phobia, is that we want to unlearn it. Okay, and that's going to be part of the process. It's going to be exposure without the anxiety and fear over time. Okay, but I do want you to know that again, there's so many, especially when it comes to sexual stuff, there's so many weird sexual deviations, and the thought is that a lot of that is kind of tied here. That somehow or another there was a time when that person was experiencing something pleasurable in the presence of, it could be an object or whatever it is, and so there was a connection with that over time. Okay. Now what's different about this? Let's talk about operant conditioning. Okay, well right off the bat, the learner first emits voluntary behavior. So we're talking about a response being emitted. Okay, we're not talking about a stimuli triggering a response. Okay, so it's very different. And they're emitting a voluntary behavior, which is then associated with a particular consequence. And we're going to talk about what is meant by consequence. Now, there's many others that contributed to this whole body of work. Probably the most famous is B.F. Skinner. Okay, and this is somewhere in the late 30s, like 38. But there has been a whole host of other people that contributed to this. But he actually came up with a lot of the terminology that we use, like reinforcement, schedules of reinforcement, intermittent reinforcement, all of those things, positive, negative reinforcement. He's the one that termed that, and so technically people tend to think of him. So he really made this form of learning very famous. The Behavior of Organisms is probably the most famous learning theory book around that made a big change in psychology. And most human learning does take place through this process. So that's why I want you to know both of these. There is a lot that takes place through the other process. However, most of it we can attribute to operant conditioning. Okay.